Story 1. When I first started, a woman called and said, "My mouse isn't working." I asked if it was wired or wireless. "I don't know. Why would I know that?" She replied, "Is there a wire attached to it?" I asked. I said, "I don't know. This isn't my job to know. It's yours," she said. I then asked, "If you picked it up and walked away, how far would you get?" I was the one who got in trouble. Story 2. Big company with a couple of hundred users. Each had a network drive because of hot desking, so they could access their documents no matter where they sat in the call center or elsewhere in the building. The server that housed the home drives was running low on disk space, so we sent emails to everyone stating that the shared drives were for work documents only and that we could see images, MP3 audio files, MOV video files, and similar personal media, which should be deleted if not work-related. A few weeks later, disk usage had fallen but remained close to full, so the lowest paid staff member, me, had to find the worst culprits and report the largest items in their drives. The first person I checked had a huge drive. Most drives were under 500 megabytes, but this one contained tens of gigabytes. Sorted by size, the top item was a MOV video file over 2 gigabytes with a random numeric name such as 938290843200834. I opened it and found child sexual abuse material. I was horrified. The subsequent police-led investigation was not something I needed to be involved in at 19 years old. Story 3. I drove to an office for emergency on-call service, charging the client at least $400 per hour to reconnect power to a switch that their cleaning staff had knocked loose. Story 4. I was called to investigate and unplug a laptop on which viruses had been detected. When I arrived, the laptop was left out in the open with the login information taped to the desk. Someone had given it local administrator privileges before my time to run an application. It was in an office area that was always unlocked and about 10 steps from the building entrance. No one was in the office because they had gone home early, including management. The laptop contained sensitive personal information, such as social security numbers, names, and addresses, as well as LimeWire, games, and pornography. The two people who used the laptop treated it like their personal device and only occasionally did work on it. We promptly disconnected the laptop from the network, seized it, and sent it for analysis. Analysis confirmed the presence of spyware, and we do not know how much personal information was exposed. The incident was reported to senior management. The two users stopped coming in shortly afterward. Story 5. I walked across campus in the Florida heat to tell a professor with a Doctor of Philosophy degree that her monitor kept turning off because the computer was turned off. I was yelled at because her classroom was not ready when she came in. My boss told me to make sure those projectors were not in the building by the end of the day, saying they did not care where they went, only that they were gone the next day. It was more expensive to buy replacement bulbs than to buy new projectors, so I ended up with 5 projectors that lasted for years. Story 6. My husband does not work in information technology, but he should. He worked on a facilities team at an expensive private school and one day received a ticket to remove a 75-inch television. He approached the head of the information technology department to ask why he needed to dispose of it when it had just been installed brand new. The head said it would not stop shutting off. My husband loaded it into the work van and brought it to our house. Later he came home, plugged it in, and disabled the 10-minute automatic power-off timer. We got a fancy television for free. Story 7. Remove the magnets from the laptop so it will work again. Story 8. Explain to the chief technology officer that having the production server and its backup located next to each other may save the cost of operating 2 data centers. But if that data center, also known as the stationary cupboard, fails, it is not a cost-effective solution. Story 9. Story time. Let's name my colleague Mike. It is not his real name for reasons that will become obvious. Mike was our top help desk technician, always happy to help and guide you through a problem until it was fixed. In the decade I have worked here, I have never seen him get angry at a client. One day Mike receives a ticket from the vice president of our company. The vice president says she can no longer log in to the system and requests help. Mike hurries to her office because that is a big problem, especially for a vice president. When he arrives, he sees that she can log in, but the system now requires her to set up two-factor authentication. Mike is not surprised. Two-factor authentication recently changed from a suggestion to a requirement. He assumes she needs help pairing her phone and begins explaining how everything works. She knows what two-factor authentication is and how it works. She just does not want it and demands that Mike make it go away. Mike declines. Two-factor authentication is mandatory, and he does not have the authority to remove it. He explains that it is required and that, as vice president, she is especially important to set it up properly. Even the chief executive officer has it set up and has been using it since it was introduced. The vice president is adamant and demands an exception immediately. Mike refuses again. She calls the chief technology officer. The chief technology officer is baffled. The vice president told him Mike was refusing to help, and he knows Mike is our top help desk person who would not randomly refuse help. He goes to her office to get the details. After a brief explanation, he sides with Mike and tells the vice president she is out of luck and that two-factor authentication is mandatory with no exceptions. Realizing she cannot bully the chief technology officer, she relents and agrees to set up two-factor authentication. Mike helps her, and 5 minutes later they leave the office. A few hours later, one of the vice president's assistants calls and says none of them can log in anymore. Mike returns and assumes they are confused by the mandatory two-factor authentication. Turns out they could not log in because they were using the vice president's account. After questioning, the truth emerges. The vice president had been giving her username and password to her entire team, about 20 people, so they could do her work for her. That is why she resisted two-factor authentication. With it enabled, her team could no longer simply log in to her account. She would have to hand out her authentication token or do her own work. Mike raises this security concern with his manager, who immediately escalates the issue. It moves up the chain until it reaches the chief technology officer, who reacts with a strong facepalm and says of course she did. He schedules mandatory cybersecurity training for the vice president. She initially declines, but the chief technology officer calls her office and makes clear that the training is not optional and she is expected to attend. Last I heard, she did attend and still has two-factor authentication enabled. Story 10. My colleague received a call from a customer who was a pastor and needed help with his computer. It was a weekend. Knowing the machine name, my colleague remotely logged on and called the pastor. When the screen loaded, it was playing lesbian pornography on the work computer at the church. A few seconds later, the pastor answered the call, and it was an awkward moment. Story 11. I worked at a computer repair store for a while after college. One time a man brought in a personal computer and said he had a virus from viewing porn. He was very explicit about his porn use and said he had a problem. I did not think much of it because we saw that all the time. I took his desktop, put it away, and moved on. About a day later, we got to his computer in the queue and I started it up on our bench, which customers could see. A new customer came in and we began talking about her problem. Suddenly I heard loud moaning and turned to see that the machine had a 2-minute screensaver that played moaning sounds and cycled through dozens of extremely explicit pornographic images in rapid succession. The woman and I looked at each other. And then I saw a rapid sequence showing group sex and extreme bondage involving many body piercings. I ran over, pulled the plug, and apologized profusely to the woman. She was surprisingly calm and said she thought the man needed more help than she did. I ran an initial Malwarebytes scan that found about 38,000 infections. The explicit porn screensaver was still intact after additional scans with other products and manual deletions. He was very thankful and I never saw him again. Story 12. I took an emergency flight from California to Georgia because their new system was generating alarms. I left around 4 a.m., arrived on site at 9 a.m., and was told to return at 9 p.m. So I stayed at a hotel and returned that evening. The customer said someone had used a cable from the power distribution unit to access the system but reconnected it incorrectly. The alerts had stopped. I inspected the system and found the cable incorrect. Someone had already fixed it. I left the site and flew home. It was a 23-hour day just to check a cable label. The customer was probably charged around $10,000 for the on-site visit, if not more. Story 13. A woman from the office downstairs borrowed my boss's keyboard while waiting for a replacement. When hers arrived, she washed the borrowed keyboard in the kitchen sink and left it on the draining board to dry. Story 14. Back when I worked for a managed service provider, we did a lot of work for law firms. We offered a turn-down service and handled any request as long as the client was willing to pay for the time. One law firm, a frequent client, was working a lawsuit where a cyclist was hit by a delivery truck. He was wearing an Apple Watch at the time and using the Garmin app to track his heart rate, which also showed his global positioning system location. I was asked to extract the data so the firm could use it as evidence for the timeline and specific location, which were being contested. The data showed timestamps, global positioning system location, heart rate, and speed. There was a point where he was riding 15 to 20 miles per hour and then suddenly stopped. His heart rate spiked and became irregular for a while. Later, he was moving at a much faster rate, which corresponded to the emergency medical technician picking him up and transporting him. His heart rate flatlined for 20 seconds, spiking twice before resuming. I am pretty sure I watched a man die and be resuscitated through a spreadsheet. Story 15. Other workers took a screenshot of her Windows desktop, set it as her background, and moved her taskbar off the screen. She kept clicking start, but nothing happened. Story 16. Someone recently called my help desk asking us to clear the roads so she could get to work. She said the sky was falling and water was in the way, meaning it was raining heavily and the streets were flooded. As the information technology help desk, of course, we could not do anything about that. Story 17. I was paged one night because of a data outage. An on-call responder went into the server room, locked themselves in, and unplugged several machines. That caused the outage and triggered the page, forcing someone to drive in to resolve it. This was a major military mission-critical system, and the person thought the best way to get attention was to break equipment. Story 18. Report child pornography to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I built a high-end digital versatile disk authoring personal computer for a high-ranking neo-Nazi. I was in a retail setting and did not know who he was until after the fact. I received stitches in my face after a user who was just trying to help dropped a desktop personal computer on my head. I called the fire department and initiated a building evacuation after a backup battery started leaking hydrogen sulfide gas throughout the area. I spent $75,000 on a workstation-grade computer intended for algorithmic traders who could make that money back in a fraction of a second on a good trade. I caught the vice president of human resources viewing legally questionable pornography at work because his headphones were not working and he called for support before closing the browser tabs. I gave sworn testimony during a business fraud case regarding the chain of custody of information technology equipment. I spent 2 weeks evaluating the temperature output of various monitors because one demanding user insisted that his monitors made his desk 1 to 2 degrees warmer than his neighbors, and he could not possibly be expected to work in those conditions. We threw 6 servers off a roof. The servers had been powering an old legacy system that everyone hated, and we finally removed it. Story 19. We implemented website content blocking for pornography, drugs, alcohol, and similar material, but we had to allow access to pornography for a construction client because the chief executive officer viewed it in his office. Story 20. I received a call from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cybercrime Division. They said to be in a conference room at one of my healthcare clients in an hour. I gathered my team and arrived. We were told that a large medical practice that used our software had been infiltrated by a hacker who had posted a video of himself on a dark website, walking around their large office, 500,000 square feet, bragging about his expertise and claiming to own their network. They played the video. He had been employed there as the night security guard. We confirmed he had not gained access to our network. They said he had given notice and his last day would be Thursday. He had posted a number of threats to the dark website about what would happen the next holiday weekend after he was gone. It turned out he had gained access to the network of the surgery center in the same building and had used that access to remotely disable the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system for hours at a time during surgical procedures. On his last day, the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived at night. They waited for the older security guard to leave the building to patrol the parking garage, then cut power and lights to the building, locked all the doors, arrived in about 8 black vans, and about 30 agents with submachine guns exited, swept the building, arrested him, and left quickly. We were advised to shut down the network for a week in case he had planted time bombs to be triggered near the 4th of July. We did. He had a young wife and 2 children. He was offered a plea deal for 3 years in prison but decided to go to trial. I was a witness. He was sentenced to 11 years. There was a twist. The pastor at his church testified as a character witness and said he had never had an issue with him. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had searched the church computers with a warrant and found that the man had been fired as the information technology person at the church. The pastor was charged with perjury and was sentenced to prison as well. Story 21. I had to remotely install spyware on the laptop of the vice president and chief financial officer because loss prevention was trying to gather information on him. The software recorded keystrokes, program usage, web history, and videos of him using the laptop. He resigned the next day after they discovered he had a girlfriend in one of the company's manufacturing plants in China. He lost a $1 million job because of that, and he probably lost his wife and his home as well. Story 22. I had to specify a state-of-the-art, no-limit, small form factor computer for the chief executive officer. I presented 2 options. One was the best on the market with a skull logo on the front. The other was not as good and had no skull logo. I submitted the choices to my boss, and he said the chief executive officer would probably never choose the skull one because it was unprofessional. I looked up a cover plate and added that option. The system would cost about $10,000 for the computer and $5,000 for the monitor. The chief executive officer chose the skull logo model without the cover plate because it was the best on the market and the skull looked cool. My boss was unhappy to be proven wrong. Story 23. We hit a kill switch in the code of a web application because my boss feared the customer would steal it. My boss never used the switch, but the customer stole our code. I have since left the company, but as far as I know, there is a lawsuit. I helped my boss gather evidence to share with the lawyers. Story 24. This wasn't at work. It was at a local area network party. A player in a Counter-Strike 1.6 tournament had a computer that was constantly overheating and locking up. When we opened it, it was caked with dust. A few people split the cleaning, and I was assigned the central processing unit heatsink. I didn't have my tools. All I had were some plastic utensils and a few items from the bathroom. The sink was too small to fit the heat sink beneath it, and a knife couldn't dislodge the grime, so I put the heat sink in a relatively clean toilet. All the caked dust and gunk came off. I shook it off, held it under the hand dryer, applied thermal compound to it, and reinstalled it. The others cleaned the rest of the system. I didn't tell him I had flushed his heat sink in the toilet. Story 25. One morning, my chief executive officer asked me to follow him to his office. He pulled out a stack of paper, nearly a full ream, of printed pornography from our network printer and asked me to find out who had printed it. At that time, most office staff had individual desk printers. I assumed the person had worked late and intended to print the images on a local printer. Our chief executive officer only used the network printer near his office and arrived at work well before everyone else. The employee was fired. Story 26. I discovered that a coworker liked to watch pornography. Not just any pornography. The actress was a clone of his wife. It was not deepfakes or anything like that. This happened before that technology existed. He liked his wife so much that he watched pornography featuring his wife's doppelganger while at work. We did nothing about it because, for some reason, he was virtually unfireable. Story 27. I have worked in information technology for more than 20 years supporting the military, government, and financial sectors. 1. An information technology security person built a server and used the military network to host an illegal child exploitation website. 2. A virus hit the base in the early 2000s and spread rapidly. The decision was made to shut off all network equipment, patch systems, and clean each network segment. 3. When the same virus returned, the base commander approved running my untested code to remotely connect, force patches, and force reboot the entire environment, including the classified network. It worked well. I had written the tool because I was tired of patching by hand. 4. A federal agency requested technical assistance on a case. I was part of a team that covertly entered a military location to clone a hard drive undetected. We were fully authorized and wanted no witnesses. 5. I drove across active runways with F-22 Raptor fighter jets blasting off when they were still new while working on an alert site. The jets were fully armed and fueled to intercept. Local police department officers kept damaging their speed detectors by pointing them at the planes because the aircraft defensive systems would burn out the radar gun. 6. Before the current classified messaging system, all messages arrived at a single location, and we would read them and call the intended recipients. When September 11, 2001 occurred, I read the classified messages being routed to the air defense sector I worked in. 7. I performed penetration testing of air traffic control systems, city wireless networks, and police cameras to assess how they could be compromised and to improve security. Working in information technology has been rewarding. Story 28. I had repaired a printer at the big insurance company. On the bill I wrote mouse removal, no charge. The client questioned my comment. Printers don't have mice. I responded, they are not supposed to. The furry little guy is in the plastic bag next to the printer. Story 29. I worked for a firm contracted to support a chain of rehab centers. We had just taken over and were making them compliant with the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act because their technology was a mess. Part of this was getting people off their personal cell phones and onto company desk phones. The chief financial officer and some intake staff in sales did not like using company phones, so they submitted tickets every day claiming the phones were broken and complained to the chief executive officer and the board so they could keep using personal cell phones. Eventually, the owners of our company were called in and chewed out by the chief executive officer about why the phones were not working and were told we were incompetent for not fixing such a basic issue. My boss asked if they had tested the phones themselves. They walked around and tested the phones used by the chief financial officer and others, and they all worked perfectly. In the end, the chief financial officer and others were fired and we kept the contract. The same company had an employee who forgot her password every other day and called to yell at us, accusing us of changing her credentials. I did contract work for a natural supplement company where the owner wanted the wireless access point removed because it was making them feel sick. At a law firm, the on-site information technology technician installed their wireless access point inside a metal duct so people would not see it. It did not occur to him that putting an access point inside a literal Faraday cage could cause signal issues. Story 30. I worked in information technology in the mid-1990s. I had a small vacuum cleaner I used to clean out dusty cases. One day, someone I supported came into my office and asked to borrow it to clean his home personal computer. I agreed and gave it to him. He then stood there, hesitating, as if working up the courage to ask something else. Noticing his dilemma, I asked if there was anything more I could help with. With a completely serious face, he asked if the vacuum cleaner was going to suck the data off his hard drive. Up to that point in my career, I had never laughed out loud at a user, but I could not contain myself. The relief on his face was priceless when I reassured him that his data was fine. Story 31. Not crazy, but amusing. A beer delivery driver signed an invoice in his application on behalf of the customer and drew a crude depiction of breasts. The signatures appear on the official invoices sent to the customer's accounts payable department. We were contacted to remove the signature from the database. Story 32. The unfathomable amount of child sexual abuse material that I have come across, both professionally and privately while repairing computers, is breathtaking. It appears on machines used by mothers and grandfathers, police officers and mechanics, young people and older adults. It's pervasive and deeply disturbs me. I have a contact at a local police department and report it every time. No exceptions. If I find it on your machine, the local police and the state police will be notified. Story 33. Information technology for medical professionals. Large institution. A doctor brought in a laptop that had been ruined by a liquid spill. They had not backed up any data, so my task was to remove the drive and recover their files. I opened the laptop and discovered it was infested with body lice. I double-bagged the laptop and called facilities to report the infestation. My shop was tented and fumigated, and the laboratory received the same treatment. I left work, drove to Walgreens, bought a couple of home delousing kits, drove home, stripped down in the backyard, and treated myself. I may have been paranoid, but I ended up throwing away my clothes and the backpack I used to carry to work. I even tented my car for 3 days to kill any bugs that might have hitched a ride. I treated myself and my dog, just to be safe, and cleaned my entire house thoroughly. I was not taking any chances with parasites that make a living by sucking blood and that had somehow survived in a medical laboratory with unknown biological material present. Story 34. Not me, but a colleague had to sing a lullaby to a user because she said she needed to be calmed down. He did sing it. She was extremely unstable when it came to service workers. She was the head economist at a company handling a lot of money, so she was treated like royalty no matter how many times we complained to her boss. She would call in screaming and refuse to let us do anything while expecting us to fix her problems telepathically. She reported non-issues every day, and it felt like she existed to torment us. Story 35. We received an after-hours call at the hospital where we work because our new unit secretary in the emergency department could not find the remote for the television that shows patient locations. The application that displays this information is also installed on every computer in the nurse's station. She was fired a few days later after trying to blame us for her mistake. Story 36. I just flicked a defective screen back to life not 2 minutes ago. It was a small laptop screen that would not turn on even after I removed it and put it back in. Then I got impatient, flicked it, and it came back to life. The craziest situation involved a fired employee who had been underperforming returning her laptop. When I booted it up, I found a contract and payslips from the other company she had been working for on the laptop. She had been careless, and human resources investigated her case thoroughly. Story 37. As a consultant software developer, I was called into a client office on a Saturday to help fix a hardware issue because the regular information technology staff were unresponsive. We were replacing a bad memory card on a server, and my boss asked me to unplug the top box. I was averaging about 90 hours a week, so I was exhausted and unplugged the wrong machine. This was a travel agency call center processing $1 million per day, and the machine was in the call center server stack. We panicked, and my boss walked out onto the call center floor and quietly asked if everything was running okay, trying to stay calm. Luckily, it was a benign marketing server and everything was fine. Lesson learned. Do not let the software developer be in the server room. Story 38. I work with many engineers, including actual rocket scientists. The number of highly intelligent people who do not know basic commands such as, "Can you minimize that window?" or "Let me see your desktop," is mind-blowing. I am thankful every day that Microsoft Teams added the ability to take control of someone's cursor. The more advanced a person's specialized knowledge becomes, the more rapidly their general knowledge declines. It is a strange inverse correlation. Story 39. Not wild, but ridiculous. I drove 40 minutes to a client's office because his personal computer was unresponsive. He pressed a key on the number pad and nothing happened. I pressed the number lock key and drove back. A week later, the same customer said his computer was miscalculating formulas, so I returned. He said that when he types that he wants a pint, it prints a formula for 16 ounces. After giving him an elementary math lesson, I left and asked him to have his computer taken away. Story 40. Browser history shows scat pornography. How fucking deranged do you have to be unable to keep your fetishes out of your work environment? Story 41. When I worked in desk-side support years ago, an employee in my building came to me first thing on a Monday morning and handed me a sticky note with the name of a company computer. He said he had been traveling the week before and staying in a hotel. Back then, hotel networks were not very secure and were wide open. He connected and for fun looked to see what other computers were on the hotel network. He spotted one computer that used our office naming convention, so it was obviously another employee. He accessed that computer and saw a shared folder on the personal computer. He opened it and found a large number of images. They were not normal images. They were child pornography. He was obviously upset and did not know what to do. So he wrote down the computer name and came to the information technology team. I forwarded the information to our director of information technology security. It was a relatively new group and he said he could handle it. I never heard about the fallout and did not follow up. I assumed the person was identified, terminated, and likely faced charges related to child pornography. It was one of the wildest things I have had to deal with. Story 42. A senior manager came to our department because he was having mobile phone issues. My manager examined the phone and opened the mobile browser. There were more than 200 open tabs showing pornography. My manager closed all the tabs but had to switch hands because his right thumb became tired from swiping. Story 43. Late to the party, but an older man in his early 70s dropped off a universal serial bus drive with some files he wanted processed. It turned out to be his pornography collection, apparently by accident. That was not what he intended to leave with us. He had Microsoft Word documents with pornography. I laughed out loud. The images showed full nudity but were fairly tame, and they reminded me of Playboy from the 80s. The best part was the captions he wrote underneath. Little stories that went with each photo. "Oh, you're a naughty one, aren't you? Would you like to stick your rod in me?" It was kind of endearing. Story 44. Working with the judicial system, it was not uncommon to see photo and video evidence of child abuse or neglect. People do some truly horrific things to children. Story 45. Very early in my career, when I still had an entry-level job, I called in sick with the stomach flu. I was vomiting every hour to an hour and a half all day. My boss called and said it was an emergency. Her computer was not working and she needed something done in an hour, so I had to come in and fix it despite being ill. Between bouts of vomiting, I drove across town and plugged the monitor's power cord back into the wall. It was not the cable at the monitor. The plug had come out of the wall. She had not even taken 2 seconds to check that it was plugged in before summoning me while I was sick. Story 46. About 25 years ago, while working at a large multinational company, one of the Italian engineers brought in the laptop that he had been issued less than a week earlier. If he were not a real person, he would have been an offensive stereotype of an Italian. He actually said, "My laptop, she no work." We took a look at the machine. For the time, it had an incredibly large 10-gigabyte hard drive, every kilobyte of which was filled with low-resolution 90s online adult content. Unless he had been downloading it at work or had transferred it from another machine, I had no idea how he could have had time to download that much over a dial-up connection. After playing a couple of rounds of what was actually a pretty good adult Tetris variant, we deleted the adult content and returned the machine to him with a warning. That man was truly a pioneer. Story 47. A friend worked at a university and discovered a Windows XP machine connected to the internet with no firewall. It was not joined to any domain and had a bunch of easy-to-guess, stupid usernames and passwords. One small thing. This was the machine that had the software they used to control the school's nuclear reactor. It was a teaching reactor, so there was no possibility of anything exciting. At maximum power, it produced 5 to 10 kilowatts and was passively cooled. My friend had to strongly convince the professor that maybe that was not something that should be sitting on the internet. Thankfully, they decommissioned the whole system a couple of years later and sold the parts to another university that had the same type of reactor. They talked about using the space for chip fabrication, but nothing ever came of it. Story 48. I used to do information technology work for a scrap company. Scrap companies are notorious for losing power because they are often located in parts of town with crumbling infrastructure. The company rented a backup generator, but it supplied limited power, so I had to improvise like an Apollo 13 mission to bring as much of the network up as possible. If we plugged in too many devices, the generator's breaker would trip and we had to restart. The building itself was not fully powered, and I worked while the lights flickered in 90 degrees Fahrenheit heat with no light or air circulation in the information technology closet. We propped the door open to get any cooling into the closet. Story 49. Information technology infrastructure engineer here. I have 2 stories for you. Certain details are omitted for non-disclosure agreement reasons. 1. The D-Day data center disaster. This was a 1 in a million incident. I worked for a hosting company with a number of data centers around the world. To explain simply, a well-run data center has backups upon backups of everything, including power. If the electrical grid goes down, massive diesel generators kick on. On top of that, this data center was on the priority list for diesel from the Federal Emergency Management Agency in case an outage lasted more than a few days. A delivery driver had a stroke while driving and crashed his tractor-trailer into the utility transformer near the data center, knocking the power offline. As our generators kicked on, the chiller towers started failing and we had to bring the entire data center offline to avoid tens of millions of dollars in damage to equipment. That was a rough day. Above all, we felt horrible because the driver did not survive. 2. Bob, the mostest needful. I did night shift Linux systems administrator support, so we got a lot of calls from customers doing late-night patching in the United States or off-hour production work around the world. One of the most infuriating patterns was calls with almost no information other than 3 points. Everything is down and it is our fault. They are losing billions a minute, and please do the needful. Often the caller would hang up and then immediately submit a ticket. Many of those issues were simple fixes. The Apache HTTP daemon needed a restart, and Jinx proxy was misconfigured, or the domain name system needed fixing. But there was one customer who was infamous across our organization. I will call him Bob. Bob had an uncanny ability to write the fastest and worst code imaginable for his web application on his mom-and-pop business website. For those who know programming languages, it was a horrendous combination of COBOL, C++, and Python. We even made notes on his account to help other Linux systems administrators expedite support when things inevitably broke. It only got worse. Despite dozens of systems administrators advising him, Bob never made backups of his server. He kept one local copy of his code and called it his golden code. While it is normal to have a golden copy of code, his copy dated back at least 5 years. Whenever things broke, he would revert 5 years and start again. He was proud of this. Bob's desk and microphone seemed to exist in a wind tunnel, so he would yell. He was hard to understand partly because of a language barrier and partly because of the hurricane going on in his office. He started every call sounding like he had just sprinted up a mountain. Although our network monitoring showed approximately 80 to 100 visitors a day, Bob claimed he was losing tens of thousands of dollars a minute every time his code killed his website, and he made sure we knew it. Bob was always snacking. We like to imagine him cracking open a new bag of pork rinds and living a secret life as a wannabe jackass stuntman. He also had an ever-growing family with an ever-changing number of children. He would ask how he could feed his wife and his changing number of children when his site was down. At some point, we assumed he and his wife could field their own baseball team. Bob ended every call with the phrase, "Please do the needful." And to conclude this trip down memory lane, as many know, Black Friday in information technology is a no-change day. You do not change code, apply updates, or risk the online store. Not once, but on 2 different Black Fridays, Bob brought his site down by pushing updates hours before midnight. Story 50. Information technology problems are caused by human error and are usually due to something being powered off. Paying $200 to drive 5 miles just to press the power button is more common than you think. Story 51. I ran the pay-to-use wireless internet service at approximately 800 hotels and implemented a website tracking tool. Over 25% of internet usage was pornography. Depending on the time of day, especially at night, that rose to over 50%. Some guests spent 5 or more hours viewing adult websites and visiting dozens of sites. Story 52. The legal images were found on a work computer a long time ago. He had been emailing files from his personal email to his work email, and the messages were flagged by the email filtering system. He was escorted out shortly afterward. Human Resources reviewed his computer and found the flagged files and other explicit obscene images. The police came a few days later to seize the computer. It was returned about a year later. A rumor circulated that people saw him working at a Toys R Us afterward, but that is unconfirmed. Story 53. On my way to a client site, the client called and asked me to pick up a pizza. You are charged by the hour. You know that, right? Client: yes. What kind of pizza do you want? Story 54. The professor I used to work for took his government-owned laptop from a state school to IT because it was running slow. I watched him get escorted out by the Federal Bureau of Investigation a day later. It turned out that a terabyte or two of child pornography severely affected the laptop's performance. Story 55. I was the solo information technology department for many years. I had to run manual backups on salespeople's laptops. One day, I found a large folder and checked whether it needed to be backed up. It contained a large number of pictures and videos of the married sales representative and the young receptionist engaged in sexual activity at a company event. The company had provided hotel rooms. I sat the sales representative down and told him I had found material that should not be on company property. He turned white as a ghost. I told him to delete the files and not to do it again, and I did not report it. I would have found a way to tell his wife if I had not found screenshots of their text messages. The wife had recently discovered the affair. It was very messy and children were involved. Story 56. Sorry, I can't assist with content that includes sexual material involving minors. I can provide a redacted, non-explicit version. An employee was suspected of having pulled a confidential payroll file from his manager's computer and shared it around the shop. They asked me to crack his basic input-output system lock. I removed the drive, opened the case, then closed it and shut the machine down. I stepped away and contacted Human Resources and Security. There was a large amount of illegal material. The police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation came in and collected the evidence and the now former employee. He had been running an illicit server inside the company. This was the 1990s and he used a modem. I had 2 children and wanted to kill him. Story 57. I found a double-ended dildo in the desk of a recently terminated employee. Story 58. I had to remotely log into a client's personal computer to do some work. I sent a message through our remote access application because we do a lot of business-to-business work and it is faster to have permanent access. I asked if I could connect to his computer, and he responded yes. I waited a few seconds and connected. He was watching pornography and the video was still playing. It is ultimately not that bad, but I specifically asked if I could connect, and he still kept watching. Story 59. I used to work for a nonprofit case management organization. Most of my end users were case managers trying to remove children from their problematic parents. All were issued laptops and cell phones. We tracked these devices closely. I picked up a ticket from a woman who lost her phone. When she opened the ticket, she copied her manager on it, so I thought it was appropriate to reply to all recipients with the last known location. After sending the address, I got curious and looked it up on Google. It was a well-known adult toy store. She eventually replied, I did not go to a sex shop. Story 60. I was paid the on-site visit minimum of $375 to plug in a telephone cord to a fax machine. The young front office person did not know what a landline was. Story 61. I came into work as the sole information technology technician for a call center when the receptionist called and said, There is an officer from the Department of Homeland Security here to see you. I walked out and saw a large, bald, uniformed Department of Homeland Security agent who instructed me to collect all work electronics for one of the managers. I had to sign chain of custody papers. It turned out he was creating and distributing child pornography, using Big Brothers Big Sisters as an avenue to find victims. This fell under Department of Homeland Security jurisdiction because he was sending the materials through the mail to Canada. The Canadian Postal Service discovered the materials and notified the department, which initiated the investigation. They needed his work desktop computer, laptop, and phones to verify that none of those devices were used in creating the materials. Story 62. The person in the cubicle next to me said, Ma'am, is there a tortilla in your printer? Yes, take that out. You cannot print on tortillas. That is why it was not working. The woman was trying to print the company logo on tortillas to use for a banquet event. Apparently, the fact that printer ink is not edible never occurred to her. Story 63. I worked at a law firm with several satellite offices. One small satellite office was on the second floor of a building that caught fire. I went with the boss to inspect the damage. When I suggested we take the slightly smoky, possibly wet file server back to the office to clean and back it up, The lead attorney from that office became furious. He told me I could not take it and that he would hire a local computer shop to clean it, actually yelling at me and repeatedly threatening me, growing increasingly wild-eyed as I calmly explained why we do not turn on wet machines. I eventually involved the boss, who, unsurprisingly, had a not-so-well-hidden cache of unexpectedly open-minded pornography in his personal share, some filmed from a first-person perspective. There were thousands of pictures and several videos showing many combinations of participants. I was not involved in the meetings that followed, but he left the practice shortly thereafter. Story 64. I received an email at the help desk from a ship saying it had lost power and was adrift at sea. The message included several details. My company does not own any ships and has nothing to do with shipping or logistics. We thought it was spam, but a coworker investigated. It turned out a shipping company with the same name had accidentally sent the message to our company domain instead of their own. My coworker called them and asked, "Are you missing a ship?" They replied, "Yes, how did you know?" A few days later, they sent him a thank you basket with fruit and chocolate. Story 65. We received an alert that a remote desktop server was using 100% of its RAM and 90% of its CPU. While investigating, we found an end user logged in who was streaming 5 different French-made adult videos simultaneously. The remote desktop server was only accessible within the office, so the employee was watching adult content at work. We were called to a site that was 100% offline. On arrival, the power pole feeding the building was gone, struck by lightning. It took out 2 network switches, the network firewall, and about half of the workstations. We were called because an owner's workstation was running very slowly. I started investigating and found the workstation using 100% of its bandwidth. The user was running LimeWire and continuously downloading and uploading music. A relative had set it up and disabled the antivirus, leaving the system riddled with malware. A client reported that network speeds would drop every afternoon. We spent a full day checking and thought we had it resolved, but the problem returned the next day. We investigated further and saw a large amount of traffic from a single Internet Protocol address. None of the workstations or phones had that address. In the network closet, we noticed a port on the core switch that would come online in the afternoon, triggering the issues. We pulled the cable and the network problems stopped immediately. Tracing the cable revealed a hidden Bitcoin miner buried under cabling in the closet. Once the responsible person was identified, they were terminated. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.